Okay, let's dive in. We're unpacking a really charged debate happening right now in Brazil.
Yeah, it's all about regulating social media.
Exactly. And what that means for, free expression online. It's complex.
It really is. And our sources, they give us a fascinating look, maybe sometimes a bit jarring, at the different battle lines being drawn.
That's right. For this deep dive, we've pulled together analysis from a commentator who, well, doesn't really hold back.
And news reports, too, plus statements from key players.
Right. Figures from the Supreme Federal Court, the STF, and even the former First Lady, Michelle Bolsonaro. It's quite a mix.
It is, and it reveals some deep disagreements and, frankly, some surprising viewpoints.
And our mission here is clear. We want to cut through the noise, pull out the key insights from all this material.
And really understand the core arguments.
Yeah, and the potential impact as the STF considers these new rules for online platforms. Because, as you'll see, the stakes, well, they couldn't be higher for how information flows these days.
Absolutely. I mean, this whole debate, it's not happening in a vacuum, right? It's a direct response to the sheer power and reach of social media.
And the proposed solutions bring their own intense reactions.
Definitely.
So let's start with the main event, sort of. The STF is poised to rule on social media regulation. According to the material, how is the court specifically, Minister Luis Roberto Barroso, justifying this move?
Well, Minister Barroso's position, as it comes across in the source material, is that, look, the court didn't just jump into this.
Okay.
He states they waited, for years, giving Congress plenty of time to pass specific legislation.
Right, they were waiting for lawmakers to act.
Exactly. And since Congress didn't act, and these cases about online content kept piling up, well, the STF argues they're now compelled to decide them.
So they have to rule on the cases before them.
Yeah. Barroso's point, very clearly stated, is that they see this not as legislating from the bench, but simply fulfilling their judicial duty, resolving the legal controversies that landed in their lap.
Okay, so the court's framing is, Congress didn't build the bridge, cases are piling up, so we have to cross the river. Makes sense from that perspective. But the commentator we're reading, Ricardo Diaz, he sees this justification very, very differently, doesn't he? What's his take?
Oh, he's intensely critical. Ricardo Diaz frames Barroso's explanation not as some kind of legal necessity, but as an excuse. That's his word.
An excuse.
Yeah, an excuse for the STF to effectively legislate from the bench. He really pushes back hard on this idea that congressional inaction forces the court's hand.
How so?
He argues, quite pointedly, that Congress, phase or nada, doing nothing is itself a legislative decision. It's a choice not to regulate in a certain way.
That's interesting. Inaction is an action or a decision.
Exactly. So in Diaz's view, the court stepping in now, using congressional inaction as the reason, that's fundamentally paving the way for censorship.
Wow. Okay. That's a really sharp distinction he's drawing there. Now, despite the SDF clearly moving forward, the sources also mention the political opposition hasn't given up hope entirely. What are they hoping for?
Well, according to the news reports we looked at, opposition parliamentarians are actively trying to pressure one specific minister, Kassio Nunes Marques.
Okay, Nunes Marques. What do they want him to do?
They want him to request a vista. Now, for listeners maybe not familiar, a vista is basically asking for more time to review the case.
It hits pause on the whole thing.
Right, pauses the judgment. And the hope is maybe this delay could somehow change the dynamics, maybe even the final outcome.
So, a procedural delay tactic, that makes sense. But the commentator, Ricardo Diaz, he seems incredibly skeptical that Nunes Marques will actually, grant this favor to the opposition. Why the deep mistrust there? What are the sources saying?
Yeah, Diaz isn't just skeptical. He's openly sarcastic about it in the material. He directly brings up Nunes Marques' past decision regarding former President Lula's eligibility.
Ah, the Lula case.
Right, implying that action certainly didn't align with what the right or the opposition would have wanted. He says something sarcastic like, oh yeah, that guy, the one who gave Lula his eligibility back. He's a real right-winger, isn't he? A true conservative.
Ouch.
Yeah, it's a clear rhetorical jab, basically undermining the whole idea that Nunes Marques is some reliable ally for the opposition on this issue.
Okay, that definitely adds some political spice to the commentary. Let's pivot now to another voice from the political sphere that's featured in the sources. Former First Lady Michelle Bolsonaro.
Right, and the commentator, Ricardo Diaz, he was actually quite impressed by her speech.
He was. So what's her core argument? Why does she think this push for social media regulation is happening?
Well, Michelle Bolsonaro's central claim, and it's quite forceful in the sources, is that this intense interest in regulating social media, it's not really about public safety or fighting misinformation.
No. What is it about then, according to her?
It's about controlling the flow of information. Because, in her words, the truth reaches the people through social media.
So she sees social media as a vital channel for truth.
Exactly, an unfiltered channel. And she asserts that the left, as she puts it, wants to regulate it precisely to shut down that truth.
Okay. And does she back this up with specific accusations against the left in her speech?
Yeah.
You mentioned the commentator noted her oratory.
Oh, yeah. She portrays them as deeply hypocritical. For example, she describes them as capitalists disguised as socialists.
Interesting phrase.
Yeah, claiming they love the fruits of capitalism for themselves, but want to promote poverty for ordinary people. And she uses a very specific personal example.
Which one?
Related to when they left the presidential palace, she mentions accusations that she'd stolen furniture, like 261 pieces.
Wow, that's specific.
Right. She calls this a complete lie. She characterizes it as an articulation, a setup, basically, to use public money without bidding for renovations, allowing others to live the way they like.
So misuse of funds and false accusations.
That's her claim. And she expresses deep frustration that even though she says they proved the furniture was all accounted for, her reputation was assassinated for a year. She claims the extreme left somehow comes to believe in their own lie and spreads it very convincingly.
So a strong counter-narrative there.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And she really hammers this hypocrisy theme. She even brings up designer brands, suggesting some socialists are only socialists until they run into a Hermes, a luxury bag.
Ah, the luxury goods critique.
Exactly. Contrasting it with her support for a liberal economy, for business, for entrepreneurs.
That furniture anecdote, though, that's certainly a vivid example she uses to make her point about alleged dishonesty.
It is. And like you said, the commentator, Ricardo Dias, was clearly impressed by her delivery.
What did he say exactly?
He gave her really high praise for her speaking skills, said she temotem de oratoria. Basically, she has the gift of oratory.
High praise indeed.
Yeah, he even suggested she'd be a more effective political candidate than, say, Bolsonaro's sons, specifically because of her ability to connect and persuade when she speaks.
Interesting political commentary there. It sounds like her perspective really resonated with his own frustrations.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Let's turn to what might be one of the most practical and maybe controversial aspects discussed in the sources regarding potential regulation.
Okay.
A specific mechanism for content removal mentioned by Minister Louise Fox. What did the commentator highlight about Fuchs's proposal?
Right. Ricardo Dias really zeroes in on Minister Fuchs's stance here. Fuchs apparently advocated for immediate content removal based simply on a notification.
Just a notification.
Yeah. The quote Dias focuses on is Fuchs saying, "Notificou, mentira, quer botar de novo, judicializa."
Can you translate that roughly?
It's something like notified, lie, want to put it back up, go to court.
Okay, wow. So the rule would be, someone flags content as a lie, the platform has to take it down immediately.
And if the user or the platform disagrees, they have the burden. They have to go to court to get it put back up.
That's exactly it. It fundamentally shifts the burden of proof.
And how did Ricardo Dias react to that proposal?
Oh, this is where he gets really, really critical. He calls the proposal absurd, born of ignorance, even barice, which is pretty strong, means like stupidity.
Why such a strong reaction?
Is for fear, and the reason he sees this as a direct path to censorship is purely practical. He argues platforms deal with millions, maybe billions of pieces of content.
Right.
They're simply not going to spend the huge amounts of money it would take to hire lawyers and go to court every single time a user's video or post gets flagged and removed under a system like this.
It's just not economically feasible for them.
Exactly. He says the economic reality is they'll just remove the content and leave it down. Vai censurardi pronto, they'll censor it and that's that. To avoid the legal hassle, the cost, effectively censoring speech without any prior judicial check on whether it actually was a lie or illegal.
So, the commentator's argument is that the mechanism itself, even if it includes a path to reinstatement through the courts, creates a practical situation where that path is just too expensive, too burdensome to actually use, leading to de facto censorship.
Precisely. It completely inverts the usual process, right? Instead of needing a court order to remove potentially protected speech, you'd need one to reinstate it. And the cost makes reinstatement prohibitive for almost everyone involved, especially individual users.
Yeah, I can see that.
Dias also points to this other detail, a moment where Fuchs apparently mentioned no droit, like we too, when discussing the criteria for this.
We too. What did Dias make of that?
Dias interpreted it as maybe an accidental slip, revealing that the outcome, or maybe the specific criteria, are already kind of pre-decided between a few key people. It just added to his suspicion about the whole process.
That certainly adds another layer to the commentators, a deep skepticism about how this is all unfolding. Okay, let's try to bring these different threads together now, based on the sources we've explored. So we've got the Supreme Court justifying its intervention, citing Congress's inaction. We have the political opposition pinning hopes on a procedural delay.
Right.
We have a prominent political figure like Michel Bolsonaro framing regulation as a move by the left to suppress truth and hide corruption.
Using some very pointed examples.
Yeah. And then we have this deeply controversial mechanism proposed by Minister Kassio, which one commentator argues will inevitably lead to practical widespread censorship because of how it flips the burden and the cost.
Exactly.
So what does this collection of views and proposed actions really tell us about the state of this debate in Brazil right now, based on our sources?
Well, what really stands out when you put these pieces together is the fundamental clash. It's not just whether social media should be regulated, but critically how it should be regulated. And there's this intense distrust surrounding the motives behind it all and the very real practical consequences of the methods being proposed.
Right. The how seems to be the real sticking point.
Yeah, absolutely. The commentator's fear, which is echoed or amplified by Michel Bolsonaro's specific accusations, is that the approach being considered by the judiciary, especially if Fuchs's immediate removal idea, isn't just regulation in a neutral sense.
They see it as something more.
They see it as a deliberate move towards controlling the flow of information, using the judicial process and its inherent costs to basically create a system where platforms are just incentivized to silence speech that might be inconvenient or controversial.
Regardless of whether it's actually illegal or false.
Exactly. So it reveals this deep divide. One side sees necessary judicial action to fill a void left by Congress. The other side sees the judiciary being used essentially to implement practical censorship under the guise of regulation.
And specific mechanisms like Fuchs's proposal are seen as the potential instrument for that censorship.
Precisely. That's the fear being articulated.
And bringing it back to you, the listener,
Yeah.
Why should this specific situation in Brazil, with its unique legal figures, its particular political dynamics, why should it matter to you?
Well, because the core tensions here, they're universal.
Explain that.
The power of these huge platforms, the challenge of defining and dealing with harmful or false content online, the proper role of courts versus legislatures, and crucially, the practical impact of new rules that shift the burden and the cost of free expression.
These are debates happening everywhere.
Exactly. Look at the Brazilian context. It just shows one stark example of the kinds of mechanisms being proposed and the intense fears they generate about, well, practical censorship and who ultimately gets to control what we see and say online.
It really is like a live case study, isn't it?
Yeah.
Trying to fit our old legal frameworks onto this new digital world.
Yeah, and how solutions, whether intended or not, can have these massive practical effects on free speech and just the way information moves.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the sources, the core picture they paint is pretty stark, would you say?
I would.
You've got a powerful judicial body moving to regulate social media, saying it has to because the legislature didn't act. This move is met with intense political opposition, but also, critically, these profound fears voiced by commentators.
That specific proposed mechanisms, particularly that idea of immediate content removal that requires a court fight to undo.
Right. That mechanism represents a practical pathway to widespread censorship.
Yeah, regardless of the stated intentions. A
Yeah.
way to stifle the very platforms that some people, like Michel Bolsonaro in her speech, see as vital channels for getting truth out, especially when they perceive attempts to control the narrative elsewhere.
And that leaves us, and you, the listener, with something pretty significant to ponder, doesn't it?
It does. In this ongoing global conversation about online speech, if the practical cost, the sheer expense and hassle of defending your content against removal becomes too high, does it even matter what your theoretical legal rights are on paper?
That's a heavy question.
It is. And as these battles play out, not just in Brazil, but everywhere, who or what forces do you see as actually wielding the most power in deciding what stays visible online and what just disappears? This Brazilian debate, as revealed in these sources, it really offers a potent, maybe uncomfortable lens through which to consider those questions.